Quick heads up before the video starts, the original recording for the full video ended up being just about an hour long, and even as I finished cutting, it was still over 30 minutes. I usually make videos at a shorter length, and I'm not gonna make anybody watch through a 30-minute video in one sitting. Basically, the video is going to be split up in 2 different parts. Anyways, roll the intro. Hello everyone, today I decided to do my own take on the Random Dice Defense Legendary tier list. This really isn't a new concept, and it's been done countless times already. My friend Tags actually made a video just like this, and I actually happened to be featured in that video as well, and just like Tags, I'm not sure why I sound like that, but to be completely honest with you, I think some points made in that video are going to be better than here, mostly as the rating was done by several experienced players. And that is despite me not doing great in it. On different topics regarding random dice. I am literally out of breath 40 seconds into the clip. Yeah, you get the point. Feel free to have different opinions to mine and respectfully share them in the comments down below. But anyways, let's get straight into it. Alright, it is finally time for the Random Dice Legendary tier list. Now, I already know that this video is probably going to be very controversial. I am probably going to have a lot of unpopular opinions, and I feel like people are going to disagree with me just in general on most of these dices. Now, once again, take all of this with a grain of salt. And don't take my word for every single one of these dices. It is totally fine to disagree with me and have a different opinion to mine. Feel very free to leave your opinions in the comments down below, or to do this ranking by yourself using a link in the description. Either way, we are going to be starting out with Assassin Dice. Now, I'm going to be putting Assassin Dice at S tier, and you might be asking why. Well, Assassin Dice is great for both co-op and PvP. Assassin Dice has since release date been one of the best dices in this game. It is very good and easy to use as an aggro, but it has also always been the leading support dice in co-op. Next up we got Atomic Dice, and I am going to be putting the Atomic Dice at a C tier. Now, Atomic Dice isn't really used all that much anymore, despite being a quite solid dice in terms of damage. The Atomic Dice usually works quite well for crew raid, but also sometimes in PvP, despite the fact that it isn't really used anymore, since there are mostly better options. Next up we got Bastion Dice, which is the newest dice released to the game. This dice came out just a few days ago as of recording this video, and therefore it is quite difficult for me to actually put a good rating on it. But from what I've seen so far when playing against it and seeing other people play it, I would not be afraid to put it at an A tier. The dice seems to be doing quite a lot of damage, and it generally seems to be a really strong DPS dice. And next up we got Blizzard Dice. Now, I am going to be a little bit rough on Blizzard Dice, and I'm going to be putting it at a D tier. Blizzard Dice used to be a really solid dice back in the day, but it isn't really used anymore, and I think there are better options than using Blizzard Dice for slower games. Blizzard Dice doesn't really contribute to anything except slowness, and it isn't really used that much anymore. Next up we got Bubble Dice. Now, I am personally going to be putting the Bubble Dice at an A tier. I would have put the Bubble Dice higher up on the list earlier, but since the Bubble Dice got its nerf and a trait, I would probably be putting it at an A tier. The trait is solid, but the dice itself, without the extra crit buff that it used to have back in the day, it isn't just as good as it used to be, but it is still a solid dice. Next up we got Combo Dice. Now, Combo Dice I would have also put really high up on the list back in the day, but since the bubble nerf, it hasn't really been played all that much anymore, but I would still put it at a C tier. If you really want to, you can still play combo, but it does not work as good as it used to back in the day. And from what I know, there are only about 3 options that you can play it with, all of those 3 being quite hard to handle and master. And next up we got Compression Dice. F tier. I'm not really sure if I need to give an explanation for this rating, but Compression Dice quite literally is not used at all and has never really been used by anyone in a serious manner. Next up, however, we got Devil Sword Dice. Now, this dice has gone through a long journey in terms of buffs and nerfs as well. I would either way not be afraid to put it at an A tier. Devil Sword Dice is a solid dice and it deals quite a lot of damage despite all the nerfs that it has gotten. It is also immune to IX most of the time, and that makes it a solid dice as well. Next up, we got Dimension Dice. Now, Dimension Dice is really difficult to play with, and it takes a lot of practice. The dice can, however, be really good in PvP if you learn to use it properly. I do not have that much experience with this dice, but I will be putting it at a B tier, as I usually tend to struggle to play against it when others are using it against me. Next up, we got Earthquake Dice. Now, Earthquake used to be used a lot, but it isn't that very used nowadays. It is still a good dice, and it works perfectly fine, but it is only really used for crew raid as of what I know. So I will be putting it at C tier, because the dice really still works, but it isn't all that used or generally useful anymore. And next up for the list, we got Echo Dice. Now, Echo Dice, I'm not really sure how to rate either, but it seems to have been used quite a bit for co-op from what I've seen, but I haven't really seen it in PvP at all. Now, I think this is mainly because of the long cooldown, but generally, the dice seems to be working quite well if you do use it correctly. Now, I'm going to be putting this at a C tier, mainly because it works well for co-op, but it isn't really necessary to use it unless you really want to. Next up, we got Flow Dice. Now, Flow Dice is and has always been a really solid dice. Flow Dice works the best along with another aggro dice that you use it with, but even by itself, it can do a lot of harm against just about all players early game. I am personally going to be putting Flow Dice at a B tier because I still think it is a really solid dice, but it isn't the best dice out there. Next up, we got Forge Dice. Now, Forge Dice, from my experience, is a really strong dice. Probably one of the strongest dices that is currently in the game in terms of damage. Now, this dice isn't all that good against aggro from my experience, but if you do get your setup going, this dice is extremely strong if you learn to use it correctly. I'm going to be a little bit harsh on Forge because of the aggro, although it does work very well in both PvP and co-op. I am, however, going to be placing Forge Dice at a S tier. It could be placed at S+, but I'm going to be sticking with S tier for now. Next up, we got Giga Switch Dice. Now, Giga Switch Dice I have seen quite a lot of, but I've never actually played using it. Giga Switch seems to be a really solid and strong dice with a lot of abilities on the traits. I've seen Giga Switch go extremely far in terms of waves, and you can use it in a lot of different ways. I'm going to be putting Giga Switch at S+ tier. Next up, we got Gravity Dice. Now, Gravity Dice has been around in co-op quite a bit lately, but of course that is only for the setup of it. I haven't really seen this dice much in PvP recently, but it can do a lot of good in co-op if you're setting up. The dice also works in PvP, even though it isn't all that great, so I'm going to be placing Gravity on C tier. Next up, we got Growth Dice. I believe this was one of the first dices that was ever released to the game, and ever since its release, it has been one of the best dices in the game for many different reasons. I'm going to be putting Growth Dice at S+ tier, no questions asked. Growth Dice is solid for growing your board, and the trait gives you solid adjustments, and I don't really think there's anything else that I gotta add to it. Next up, we have Guardian Dice. Now, Guardian also isn't used super much anymore, but it does still work. And I've seen a few decks that actually uses it in modern PvP, and it also works really well for AI mode, so therefore I am going to be putting Guardian at a B tier. Next up, we have Gun Dice. Now, I think it's safe to say that Gun Dice, even since its rework, has seen many better days. This dice is still usable, but I haven't seen it played in very long. There are so many other options of dices that you can play, and with the new speed change, I am honestly not sure if it would work that well in PvP. I'm going to be putting Gun Dice at E, because I don't really see a use for it anymore, and it was only ever good for PvP, really. Next up, we have Hell Dice. Now, Hell Dice has always been a usable dice, and I do think you could use it today as well, but I do not think that it would be very strong at all. It is a good dice, but it doesn't have many good uses anymore. I'm going to be putting Hell Dice at a D tier because I do think the dice is alright, but not really an easy dice to win with any longer. Next up, we have Holy Sword. Now, Holy Sword is obviously one of the most upgraded dices in this game. Holy Sword is the dice that all co-op sweats wants to get to the highest class possible and thereby make it very far in co-op. Now, Holy Sword isn't very usable in PvP, although you could technically make it work, but considering the fact that it only really works in co-op, I am going to be putting it at an S tier. Holy Sword is a really good dice, and I think it is always going to be, but I think it's safe to say that it isn't good for all uses. Next up, we have Ignition Dice. Now, Ignition Dice is, and has always been, a really solid dice as well. The ability is pretty simple, and I think everybody knows the use of it as well, so I'm simply just going to be putting it at a B tier and leave it there. The dice still works, and it has always worked. It is a solid dice, simply. Next up, we have IX10 Dice. Now, IX10 Dice has always been a pretty decent dice as an aggro dice, and it also works really well in co-op, as it gives a solid damage boost. The dice is really strong in PvP and in co-op basically, especially with the IX trait that they added a few seasons ago. Now, I'm going to be putting this dice at an S tier, simply because it greatly increases damage in co-op, but also leaves a lot of decks chanceless in PvP if used correctly. Next up, we have Joker Dice, which is another really old dice that has been in the game forever. Joker Dice is, and has always been, one of the best dices in this game, simply because it can be used for just about every single deck there is. I'm going to be putting Joker at an S tier. I assume everybody knows what the dice does and why it is a really solid dice. I am either way putting it at S+ tier, because it goes quite well with every single deck there is, even though you could switch it out for reverse. Next up, we have Landmine Dice, and Landmine used to be one of my favorite dices in this game, even though it has never really been that super used in PvP. Landmine Dice is one of the first legendaries that you ever unlock in this game, but it isn't all that good of a legendary anymore. It used to be quite good for co-op, but after the co-op rework, it simply just doesn't work anymore. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to put Landmine Dice at an E tier, pretty much because it isn't completely useless, but it doesn't work anywhere near as well as it used to work back in the day. Anyways, next up we have Lightning Cloud Dice, which is the dice that I always end up mixing up with Storm Dice for some really strange reason. Either way, Lightning Cloud Dice is a pretty solid dice if you use the trait with it, but it also works quite well without the trait. This dice is usually combined with aggro dices as an easy way to get fast damage and to counter aggro such as IX. I personally use this dice a ton, and I think it's pretty safe up until around wave 5 or so in PvP, and so I am going to be putting this dice at a B tier because I think it works very well for PvP still to this day. Next up we have Lunar Dice, which is a dice that just about everybody upgrades as one of the first dices that they get to high classes. Lunar 12 is one of the best things that you can have in this game. It works great for co-op, it works great for PvP, it works great for AI mode, it pretty much works great for everything. Even though some people might argue against me, I am not afraid to put Lunar Dice at S+, simply because it is a really good dice in just about every single way. Next up is Metastasis Dice. Now, Metastasis Dice, since the trait got released, has been even better than before. Metastasis has pretty much always been a solid dice, especially in co-op. Now, right now, it is better than ever in co-op, I would say, but it is also quite strong in PvP, despite the fact that I haven't really seen it all that much. I'm going to be putting Metastasis at an A tier, because I think the ability that it has is really solid, and if you manage to use it at the later waves, it can do a lot of harm. But as I said, it is also really good for co-op if you're looking to get a lot of SP. Next up, we have Monolith Dice. Now, I haven't played with this dice, and I haven't really seen what it is able to do at its full potential, but from what I know, it isn't really a good dice. Now, it isn't horrible, but it isn't good either. I've only really seen it being used for co-op, but not in PvP. I'm going to be putting Monolith Dice at a C tier, simply because there aren't really that many uses for the dice, from what I know. It isn't completely useless, but it probably isn't going to be your best option. And that right there was the end of part 1. As I said, part 2 of the Legendary Dice tier list will be uploaded to the channel shortly, but until then, thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll hopefully see you in the part 2. Take care, stay safe, and later.